Welcome, everyone. I'm Howie Hawkins, the Green Party candidate for New York Governor. And we're live streaming today with our candidate for Attorney General, Michael Sussman. And I think the public and the media are in for a big surprise when they find out who this man is. He's a 40-year lawyer with a resume that would put all the other candidates in this race to shame. I mean, theirs would be here, there, and his would be up here. And civil rights, public corruption, environmental cases. And maybe Michael will talk more about that as we go along. But I think what we want to talk about today is maybe around the theme of independence. We just passed the 4th of July. We talk about political independence. And then there's the issue of the independence of the Attorney General, who is independently elected. And Michael, maybe you could talk about your perspective on being an independent Attorney General.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for welcoming on a Green Party ticket. It's a great pleasure to be with you and the other candidates. As you said, I've been an attorney for 40 years. I worked for the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division in the late 1970s after I got out of Harvard Law School. I went to the NAACP National Office from there, and I was there from 1981 to 1986. And the last 32 years, I've had my own law firm, independent of any power brokers and any structures. It's critical in New York, where we have a history of profound duopolistic public corruption, the Attorney General of the state to be someone who is outside of that structure, not beholden to that structure, not ambitious with respect to that structure. Because if that's not who's elected Attorney General, my view is we simply have more business as usual. And that's what we really, really desperately need to avoid. We have profound and justified levels of public cynicism, alienation from the process, fewer and fewer people participating with good reason. The reason is that they believe that Tweedledee, Tweedledum, and their beliefs are well justified. An independent Attorney General is someone who is not beholden to these parties and can do what is necessary to protect the public, enforce the most basic civil rights, environmental, health and safety laws, labor laws that are enacted. We've had far too little of that from the Attorney General's office and far too much knee-jerk defense of governmental agencies which trammel the rights of people. And that's fundamental to our campaign.
So why don't we talk about some issues where you would be independent? We've talked about the fact that the Attorney General's office is defending the government for not living up to the foundation aid formula, which was the way the state was supposed to meet the requirements of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case.
Right.
And they're in court defending against parents from my city in a lawsuit with people from New York City, my city, Syracuse. And then there's another lawsuit from 7 smaller cities.
Right.
And they're all high poverty school districts, and they're not getting the funds they were promised.
Well, I have some experience in that regard, in that in 2002, I settled a case against the state for its contributions to desegregation, vestiges of segregation and discrimination against Yonkers. I got $300 million from the state of New York, contributed to Yonkers for a 5-year period, to begin to redress the vestiges of segregation and discrimination. So I've experienced negotiating with the state, and I was able to get that $300 million after literally 14 years of litigation, in which I tried to hold the state responsible for its contribution to that profound level of segregation, and ultimately did so. I'm fully committed to the goals of those who have championed equitable financing in education in New York, and I would desist from defending state agencies which have been party to profound inequities and the impacts of those inequities on tens and hundreds of thousands of people's lives. I've found that negotiations with the state are very, very difficult. The state does not have a restorative justice approach. It does not have a conciliatory approach, even when caught with its pants down, so to speak, defending to the end bigots, defending to the end sexual harassers. And there are many stories of that I've been personally involved with. I think the issue you raise is critical to the state's future. We have increasing racial and ethnic group segregation in our schools. It's pernicious for the future. It's not cost effective in our society on any level, whether it be moral, legal, social, economic. It's absurd. The Attorney General should be taking the lead in enforcing our state's laws against racial segregation in school, against funding inequality, not effectively perpetuating them either by his or her silence or by actual, as you point out, defense. It's a very important issue for our future.
Well, you mentioned segregation, and we've had a number of studies in recent years that document that New York schools are the most segregated, not only by race of any state in the nation, not only by race, but by socioeconomic class.
Exactly.
And we know that of the reforms that have been done over the last 50 years, when you mix kids up, the lower class kids' scores come up and all the kids do better on other measures like intellectual self-confidence, creativity, problem solving, teamwork, the kinds of things that you want. People that want good jobs, those are values in good jobs. So all the kids do better on that. So it doesn't harm the middle class kids. But the fear is that, it's going to bring the schools down. So that's something we got to educate on. So what me and Gia Leah, the lieutenant governor candidate, who's a public school teacher in New York City, what we've been advocating is controlled choice, they call it. They do this down in Wake County, or we're doing it down in Wake County, where Raleigh, North Carolina is. And what they do is have the students and parents rank their schools in order of preference that they want to go to. And then, they try to give everybody their first choice, but there's a formula to make sure all the schools are mixed up by socioeconomic status. And the kind of results I was talking about from integration, they experienced down there. So the question becomes in New York, the New York City school district is huge. It has the diversity within it, although there are sub-districts that you may need to redraw district lines. But in places like Syracuse, Syracuse itself is very high poverty. The immediate districts adjacent to it are wealthy. And we have some of the biggest disparities for school districts right next to each other of anywhere in the country. So it would seem what you need to do there is redraw the lines to have controlled choice work. So I'm just wondering, what are the, legal issues involved in trying to have a desegregation program that would redraw school district lines so you could actually achieve it?
Well, I'm sure that if you've studied this at all, and it sounds like you have, you know that in 1975, the Supreme Court of the United States had the famous case of Milliken v. Bradley out of Detroit. And in that case, there was an effort made to, with respect to the city of Detroit, ensure that there was desegregation with its neighboring county communities in Wayne County and other adjacent counties. The predicate for that there were findings that the state of Michigan had significantly contributed to that segregation, in part by the drawing of those lines and by what they called secession school districts. So there seemed to be a sufficient legal basis under the court's reasoning to go outside, but the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, rejected interdistrict school desegregation in that case. And really, since then, it's been more of a dream than a reality. There are some examples of successful interdistrict desegregation programs, the METCO program in Boston and some others. In the South, of course, it's a different issue because the cities are within the same county, and the districts are often organized, like in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, by county. So you don't have to redraw entire district lines to get the mix you're talking about. I think that in New York, what's necessary, first of all, is political leadership, the Attorney General, the governor, state legislature, which says that we take seriously what's already in our law, that school districts should not be practicing segregation, that integration is a significant social and public value, one that we in New York want to work for. Now, remember something, Howie, this is really important. About 7 or 8 years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States said that school districts may not adopt race-conscious, voluntary race-conscious programs to desegregate schools. In the Seattle case, and in a case out of the state of Kentucky, I believe it was, they rejected voluntarily doing that. So as you put it, you have to focus more on socioeconomics than you can on race or ethnicity. But however you focus, there has to be a public commitment a strong public understanding of the advantages to this. And there are profound advantages, as you mentioned earlier. You know, the more we separate people when they're young, we know the worse it is for them attitudinally, educationally, and otherwise. We're going to have one society. We better stop pretending that that doesn't start when children are young. It does. That segregation at that age is pernicious. So I've spent a lot of time in my career trying to deal with this issue. The weight example you give is a good one about controlled choice. There are other ways to organize the schools, but the real point is the consciousness. The consciousness has to be, we're trying to have integrated neighborhoods. We're trying to have integrated schools. We're trying to bring people together and not simply perpetuate the class and race distinctions that we inherit. And that's honestly too often what public policy makers are trying to do. And we know that from every study that's been done. People get in office, as in Yonkers, and they try generation after generation to keep people apart, not bring them together. It's awful public policy.
Well, that's an issue that right now the Green Party is the only ones really bringing up.
And that's true. And, you know, that's the horror of it. The parties talk rhetorically, certainly the Democratic Party, where I was for many, many years, about racial equity and fighting and extirpating racial discrimination. When you come down to implementing in policy, you find very, 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 very little follow through. And to them, it's like the third rail. They want to avoid it. They want to avoid it.
And my perception of the move toward high stakes testing and as so-called accountability, and then turning the failed schools, which tend to be the high poverty schools, into charter schools, was the substitute for pursuing desegregation. And it's been pernicious in its own right, let alone the fact that we've become more segregated. So
another form of separate but equal. And frankly, when I was at the NAACP national office, I saw right then that there were many people across racial lines who were abandoning the strategies of desegregation. It's not just people of our race, so to speak. And I think that that's really unfortunate, because the way people started defining this was, if I'm not sitting next to somebody who's white, there's something wrong with me. And I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that we could learn from each other and grow with each other and have social contact with each other. Not that you need to be sitting next to me. We need to be sitting next to each other. And I think that's the message. And I think that message got lost. And you know, there's bitterness in all communities also about some of the consequences of desegregation, where African Americans who were in positions of authority in schools got subordinated when those schools became desegregated. I remember in Cleveland, Howie, a funny story. It's not so funny, though. It was 1979-80, and I'm sure the same is true today. Frank J. Batista, a pretty courageous federal judge, former infantryman during World War II, had ordered the school desegregation in Cleveland. And he started touring the schools to see if they were all ready for students. It was in late August. And he went to a school, a middle school, out in the African-American community. And the year before, he'd been there, and there were all sorts of wires hanging out of the school building. It was in just despicable condition. And I remember him saying at that point, how could anybody be in this school? And then the next year, the school was being readied for the arrival of white students. And he saw Al Tutela, the head of facilities, and he said to him, what have you been doing in this school? It's fantastic. And Al kind of winked at him. But that's the tragedy. Larry Tribe at Harvard used to talk about the fact that when we're separated, the resources seem to follow the groups with power. And that's why that separation is malicious and intended to keep in place people of color who don't have means. And it's something we have to fight very hard and consciously against. So I think there are a lot of benefits. Resource allocation certainly seems to follow the majority community, though. And where we separate ourselves, it leaves other people, as the Campaign for Fiscal Equity cases show, with the short end of the stick.
Okay, Michael, we've got a couple questions have come in. Sure. And the first one is, what can be done legally to address these inequities? I guess that refers to the desegregation. And that, let me just make a little more specific question on that. Milliken doesn't prevent school districts from consolidating with each other so they can have more diversity. It's just you can't do inter-district desegregation, correct?
Well, you can't do it unless, again, you have a factual basis which shows that those districts were created for segregationist reasons. And frankly, if you dig deep enough, you could often make that record. They hadn't really done that in the Detroit context, so it didn't work. Look, New York used to have a commissioner of education, and everybody should do some reading about this man. His name was Ewald Nyquist. He was from Minnesota. He came to New York in the mid-1970s. He used the power of the commissioner of education to enforce laws against discrimination in New York State. He came to Newburgh, New York. He went around the state and he saw school districts that were engaging in segregative practices, and he ordered them using what's called 310 of the New York State education law. He ordered them as commissioner of education to deal with these issues, to come up with plans and procedures like the ones you talked about earlier, referencing Wake, to extirpate the segregation. He was hated. He was hated, but he was effective. He was strong, and he believed deeply in what he was doing. We haven't had a commissioner of education like that in New York for 40 years. We certainly haven't had a governor who was supportive of what that kind of commissioner would be doing. So I think that leadership is critical. I think community support is critical, but there are plenty of legal handles. As an attorney general, I know what those legal handles are because I've used them to desegregate one of the major districts in our state, Yonkers. So I've done it. I understand how to do it. And I'm going to try to get a commissioner of education in New York working as an ally with me to actually implement the laws of our state. That's what we often don't do.
Okay, the next question moves on to the housing. Anna Liebam, I hope I pronounced that right. My concern is with the housing situation. Department of Housing and Community Renewal has very bad policies against tenants versus owners. What do you think about the tenant laws we have and their enforcement, the tenants' rights and their enforcement?
Well, first of all, I run a series of empowering centers in my region, and one of the purposes of those centers is to have free legal clinics. So in Ellenville, and which we stopped now, but Liberty and Port Jervis, for a while in Newburgh, I would go there on one night a week or one night every other week, and I'd speak with people who had legal needs and try to counsel them. And probably the single biggest issue that come up week after week were the very weak protections that tenants have in our state in general. And certainly those who live in subsidized buildings by one another of either a state or federal agency, it's not any better. In fact, under Mr. Carson as HUD secretary, it's gotten worse. He seems to have as his principal mission getting rid of public housing, which is desperately needed by people in our state. So there has to be a total revision of landlord-tenant laws in New York. In New York, you could be a perfectly decent tenant, pay your rent, do nothing wrong, and simply be evicted. Just goodbye. You get the right notice, you're gone. Landlord, I have enough of you. It creates a kind of mentality and fear in many, many people throughout the state. So I also think, frankly, that we need to have public programs that deal with home ownership in a very different way. Most major cities and small cities in our states have industrial development agencies which can, through bonding, raise money. I support, and I think as Attorney General, I champion efforts to use those IDAs for the purposes they're intended, which is public benefit, rather than simply helping large corporations that don't need those funds, can get money in the capital markets, but rather are using these vehicles, which are really there to raise money. And I think one critical way they should be using that money is by sponsoring the rebuilding of our cities, sweat equity programs that put people who help to rebuild those buildings in buildings they've helped build. We need that in Newburgh. We need that in Mount Vernon. We need it in Yonkers. We need it in Syracuse. We need it in Buffalo. We need very aggressive reconstruction programs of our cities, which will give people a stake in those cities and in their communities. And there's no reason they can't begin owning. People can't begin owning those buildings. In Newburgh, we have 600 to 700 vacant buildings in a city of 25,000 people. Ridiculous. Generation after generation, more buildings come vacant. And we don't have the public policies and programs to reinvest, to train workers, and then to give people a chance to buy those buildings as opposed to see them gentrified. It's very, very important public policy to me.
I've got a question coming up, but it's not all the way there yet.
Okay. Well, you mentioned independence, and I think there's another point I just want to bring out. I think you mentioned it a bit earlier, but it's really important to me as someone running for this office. The state agencies in New York should be a champion for protecting people's civil rights, workers' civil rights, the people who they serve. And far too often in New York, whether it's the Department of Correctional Services, whether it's the Department of Civil Services, whether it's EEC, I've seen in all of these agencies, from my personal knowledge, tremendous amounts of discrimination against women, sexual harassment tolerated, all sorts of practices which frankly are almost barbaric. And the Attorney General, rather than defending these agencies in some kind of knee-jerk way, has to go to those agencies and say to them, look, we have the rule of law here, and you have to be the champions of following that rule of law. You're the government, after all. You can't be those who are perpetuating and then defending this kind of discriminatory practice, harassing practice. And again, we haven't had that leadership from someone who really has been in the trenches, as I have been for all these years, fighting for individuals against these governmental entities. I know what these entities have to do to clean themselves up. And the Attorney General shouldn't be using a staff of 670 lawyers to be defending these agencies when they're engaging in reprehensible practices. We got to call it like it is and clean it up.
Speaking of dirty deals, let's talk for a minute about the competitive power ventures deal, where
oh God, do we have
National Treasurer of the Democratic National Committee, Peter Galbraith Kelly Jr., bribed Joe Percoco to get that plant going, which will add 10% to our carbon footprint in the state. It's a corrupt deal. How can we use that corruption to stop this plant?
Well, I've been the lawyer for the entities, the groups, the citizens who've been fighting against CPV on a number of fronts. So we've obviously given all that a lot of thought. Let me explain again, very simply, and I think it's a simple answer. About 10 years ago in Orange County, the county that I'm from here in New York, Hudson Valley, the great Hudson Valley, we had an entity that wanted to buy an old dump called Turi Landfill. And that entity came before a public regulatory hearing, and Orange Environment, an environmental organization in our county, intervened. And their point in intervening was with that sale was going to someone who was morally corrupt. The entity trying to buy Turi Landfill had a history of corrupt practices and of illegal behavior. And at the administrative hearing, they were able to show that and derail the sale on the theory that someone operating a public utility has to be able to be trusted. They're not doing this, and they shouldn't be doing this for their profit. They should be doing this as a public service. They get breaks from monopoly regulation. They get all sorts of breaks because they're supposed to be a public utility. In my mind, CPV has disqualified itself from operating that plant. We can talk about whether the plant should be operated by anyone, but CPV has disqualified itself because of that corrupt practice. The public can't, simply put, trust CPV to operate the plant. Now, the broader question, of course, is not whether they alone should operate it, but whether it should be operated. And the answer to that lies in science. 6 individuals engaged in civil disobedience and tried in December of 2015 to stop, at least for half an hour, trucks from going in and out of that facility. And I was their lawyer, and we waged a necessity defense. And that defense was intended to show that they had justification for their civil disobedience. And we brought in eminent scientists from Cornell University, Dr. Robert Allen Howarth and Dr. Anthony Ingraffia, both major noted international climatologists. And what they testified to was the total contravention between CPV, the total contradiction between CPV and current state energy policies. Our Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, when we talked with him, told us this was a bridge to the future. It's not a bridge to the future when you subsidize publicly a 40-year operating plan in the year 2018 or 19. Take 40 years, we're in 2060. When every energy policy in New York says we got to get off of these fossil fuels by 2030, we've got to do it. That's what we're committed to doing. So how can we support plants like this? It's unconscionable for the future and for our children. And frankly, Howie, I think one thing we very strongly share is a belief that we've got to try to leave this place better than we found it. Not just for us, but for our children, our grandchildren. We simply have no moral compass if we think that we can do whatever we want. CPV is an example of doing whatever we want. It's irresponsible environmentally. It's irresponsible from a health point of view. When that plant started up a couple of months ago, my office was swarmed with people calling, emailing me. I can't breathe. I can't sleep at night because it sounds like a jet engine is in my living room in my bedroom. This is not a way we could operate functionally. So there are so many grounds to deal with this. One is the identity of that particular owner, but the other is the profound incongruity between a plant like that and state policy, including the December 14 policy announced by Governor Cuomo. No fracking in New York. Well, if no fracking in New York, no fracking anywhere, we certainly shouldn't be inducing supply, should we, from a neighboring state when it's too dangerous to do that production right here? How can we justify that incoherence? Ludicrous.
It's unjustifiable.
And I know you're very strongly committed to the same thing, and I come at it, from perhaps a legal point of view, but I know that you have a very strong position on this and supporting the greening of our economy, which is so critical for job creation as well, as you've articulated over and again for decades now.
Yeah, and I think here in New York, we put the demand for 100% clean energy by 2030 in our 2010 campaign, along with the ban on fracking, when most environmentalists were saying it's the bridge to the future like Maloney did, or at best, we need a moratorium to study the water impact. We're saying, no, it's bad probably for the water, but we know it's bad for the climate. And then by 2014, the fracking ban became a big issue. We had the movement dogging Cuomo all over the state. And we got 5% of the vote. I think he was looking for those, how do I get some of those votes back? And he went with the ban on fracking, but we're not done. We do have a bill now in the Assembly that is a plan to get to 100% clean energy by 2030. So we're making progress. We just got to keep going.
You deserve a lot of credit for advocacy. People don't understand the impact sometimes of third parties. When you talk about independence, the idea that people are not going to capitulate and simply roll over to these two major parties and are going to be independent advocates and truth tellers in the society at large and are willing to take to some extent the mockery. People come up to me, they know me, they say, you were supposed to run for county executive last year as a Democrat in Orange County, and you told us you weren't running. Now you're running on the Green Party? Are you crazy? I said, no, I'm not crazy. I finally got some sanity.
Yeah,
and I finally got the courage to say that what we have to do and try to do is what's right. What's right is to say to the people like Andrew Cuomo that you're too corrupt to govern. You're too corrupt to govern. You see, this is the other part of independence. I'm not asking for anything from this man. I never have and I never will, but you're too corrupt to govern. You can't say I can be corrupt some of the time, but I do good things sometimes too. That's too low a standard for our people. Our people don't deserve that. And, I think that's where you come in and trying to set a higher example and standard. And we really desperately need that. And people have to start taking a serious look at alternatives and stop settling. And I say that for somebody who switched parties several months ago. And my fellow Democrats and ex-Democrats, it's important that you take a look around and see who genuinely wants to do the job in your interest, doesn't see the job as a stepping stone to somewhere else, which then influences him or her in their decision making. People have to come first, and we have to try desperately to empower more people. Howie, you know this better than I do. You run around the state, and we see how many people don't vote in elections. We're fighting for democracy abroad, and what do we have here? School board elections, less than 10% of the people in the state participate, right?
Right. Well,
Fire commission districts, less than 1% participate. They spend huge amounts of public money, and people are too busy or too disinterested to participate. And the same is true.
I think a lot of people feel powerless. You go out and talk to voters, and they say, the Republicans and the Democrats, they have no idea what I'm going through. They don't know who I am or what my neighborhood's like or my town is like, and all they do is look out for themselves. So I'm checking out. And I think that comes from powerlessness, not so much disinterest. But the
I
thing
agree.
about independent politics is it makes the two major parties compete for our votes so that our social movements, which do good work and raise these issues, if there's not an independent alternative on the ballot to keep everybody honest, the social movements will get taken for granted. So I think that's what people need to look at, being politically independent. Even if you don't win the office, you can leverage a lot of power as a result of the votes you get.
There's also a truth-telling process here that we have to respect, and that's the ideas are going to come not necessarily from those in the two major parties. They're not so interested in the ideas; they're interested in control.
And that's
we have to generate ideas.
That's been the historic role of third parties, whether it's abolition, land reform, monetary reform, suffrage, social insurance, workers' rights. It was third parties that brought it up, and we had a really good tradition from the 1830s until the 1930s. Unfortunately, since so much of the labor movement and the progressive movements went into the Democratic Party with the New Deal, we've lost a distinct independent left with its own voice and perspective. And that's what we got to rebuild, I think. We got a question about what could the AG do about the water pollution problem, such as what's afflicted Hoosick Falls?
Well, it's very simple. Again, I think that in that situation, there are two things that have to be done. First, the arm of the Attorney General's office, with all its investigative capacity, has to get to the bottom of exactly what happened and has to report to the public precisely what happened. I think the Attorney General's office should be coordinating those investigations. That's first of all. But second of all, we have laws in New York State to prosecute individual corporations and those who run those corporations who are in fact markedly degrading parts of our state. And these individuals should be prosecuted. And these corporations should be prosecuted, and they should be made to pay restitution. And they should be made in through the court system run by the Attorney General's lawsuits to do redress. So I think it's a very crucial role. And I think without it, you have less deterrence on those who are thinking about, and they are consciously thinking about, degrading the environment. What do I have to pay for it? And if the price is too low, it becomes an option to consider.
Well, we're running out of time. I think we got time for one more question, and that is, what about Trump? All the Democrats running for AG seem to talk more about Trump than our internal issues, but he has affected the state in a lot of ways. We've got this case that I guess the Southern District is looking into of misuse of the Trump Family Foundation. There was a column, I think on July 4th, by David K. Johnston, old Times reporter and still an investigative reporter, saying that if the governor asked the AG to look into it, the AG could get Trump's tax returns, which I think a lot of people would be interested in. What's your reaction to that idea?
Well, that specific idea, I agree it should be pursued. Now, look, I think it's very clear that you need to elect an attorney general who knows his or her way around the federal courts. It's kind of ironic to me that you have people talking about they're going to litigate against Donald Trump. But when I look at the electronic filing system at the federal courthouse in New York, these people have never been involved in a single federal case. And that goes for Zephyr Teachout. Go look it up. I was showing somebody today in my office. You put in her name, she's had responsibility for no federal case. Sean Patrick Maloney, no federal litigation experience. Letitia James, no litigation experience. I've handled 1,000 cases in the courts or more. So how is it that you're going to tell me that you're going to be running major litigation against Donald Trump when you've never litigated a case in federal court? Explain that to me. It's like saying we're going to run the Waldorf Astoria and hire a master chef. The person's never made eggs or an omelet for breakfast. Doesn't make any sense. So yes, going after Donald Trump and his excesses is critical. I don't disagree with that. But if you want to really do it and not pay lip service to it, you better hire a lawyer who knows his or her way around those courts. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this, because I know that I spent 40 years intensely struggling for human and civil rights, environmental justice in those courts. It's time to take on another role serving all the people, just like you want to do, Howie. I'm ready for that role. I honor the people, and I hope that I have an opportunity to do that.
Well, why don't you tell us what's up next for your campaign, how people can find you online, and how they can help you out?
Okay, well, there's Elect Sussman, New York State AG is our website. I also have a Facebook site that you can access, which explains what we're doing at any given point in our campaign. You can send donations up to, but not more than $118 to P.O. Box 1005, Goshen, New York, 10918, Sussman for AG. And in terms of what we're doing meets and greets at people's homes around the state. I'm going to various events, whether they be news programs or debates or whatever they may be, trying to make clear that it's a serious candidacy and that I'm a serious contender for this position. I'm not doing this lightly. I'm not doing this simply to do it. I'm doing it because I think, as I believe with you and Jen and Mark, who's running for Comptroller, Mark Dunlea, we have serious people. When I listen to him speak about the issues that he believes are important, he makes a lot of sense as somebody running for Comptroller. He do things in that position that are not now being done, that are important. And the same goes with you and your running mate for Lieutenant Governor. So I think this is something to be taken seriously. There's a desire to get a certain number of votes. I'd like to get enough votes that we could win. And I honestly feel that the people have to come to recognize that they are now being led by folks who are primarily interested in themselves. Mr. Cuomo wants to be president. He's running in 2018 for governor, take office in 2019 and start running in the primaries, just like Governor Christie did in New Jersey, right? And Christie became the least popular governor in the country, in large part because he was neglecting his state. We're going to have the same kind of problem here in New York. Believe me, mark my words. So that's why people have to start looking at alternatives. So that's really it. And I really thank you for the chance to come on with you. I'm looking forward to greeting you on the 14th with the other members of our slate at CPV. You mentioned it earlier, on Route 6 in Slate Hill. Shout out to Orange County, where we every week protest that power plant, organize, talk about what we need to do next. And you'll be with us on the 14th with Jen, as I understand it. I hope Mark's able to come, and others from the Green Party hierarchy and others. So we're looking forward to hosting you. We've got some good food for you that day, and it should be great.
Well, I hope people heard the fund appeal. We have finance reports that go into the state on July 12th. So the media, you know, the way they play it is if you're not raising money, they don't take you seriously. So everybody who's thinking about making a contribution to Michael's campaign as well as my campaign, the one G and I are running, you know, we're online at howiehawkins.org. Try to make a contribution before July 12th. And so I really appreciate people coming on and listening to us speak today. And I guess we're going to try to do this once a week. And so I'll look forward to talking to you next time.
Take care, everybody. Thanks.